You know, the Second World War, it didn't just happen. It wasn't some surprise storm that appeared overnight. No, this was the end of a long, slow-motion train wreck. A 20-year-long chain reaction of failures and bad bets that started the second the last war ended. So let's take a look at how those dominoes fell, one by one.
And that chain reaction, it all starts right here, with the Treaty of Versailles. This was supposed to be the peace that ended all wars. But here's the thing you have to understand. While it definitely created a lot of anger in Germany, it also left the country completely intact. It left them feeling cheated and still, believe it or not, potentially the most powerful nation in all of Europe.
And when you talk about fairness, you have to look at this. Germany complained loudly about Versailles, right? But the terms were actually pretty tame compared to the brutal peace treaty Germany had forced on Russia just a year earlier. So this flawed peace, it's just sitting there in a huge power vacuum. America's gone back into isolation, the Soviet Union is a pariah, and the winners, Britain and France, they can't agree on anything. It's a recipe for disaster.
So, the first real test of this fragile new world order, it doesn't come from Europe. Nope, it comes from halfway around the globe, in Asia. And it's here that the whole international system is about to show its fatal flaws for everyone to see.
It's 1931. Japan invades the Chinese province of Manchuria, claiming it was self-defense. So what does the world do? Well, the League of Nations responds, but incredibly slowly. They send a team to investigate, which takes months and months. By the time they even write their report, Japan has already finished the entire conquest. It's a done deal.
So here it is. After all that time, the League finally gets around to condemning Japan's invasion. And Japan's response? They basically just shrug and walk right out of the League of Nations. No consequences, no sanctions, no military force, nothing. It was a massive sign to the world that this new international system was completely, utterly powerless. And that right there, that was the first domino to fall. The signal it sent was loud and clear to anyone with an appetite for conquest. The lesson was simple. You can break the rules, you can invade your neighbors, and the worst you'll get is a strongly worded letter. And you better believe one man in Germany was paying very, very close attention. Okay, let's bring it back to Europe, because that echo from Asia, it gets heard loud and clear. Adolf Hitler, now in charge of Germany, sees the League's weakness as a total green light. So he starts to push. He starts to gamble, taking the Treaty of Versailles apart one piece at a time.
First, he does exactly what Japan did. He pulls Germany out of the League of Nations. Then, he just openly announces he's rearming the country, a massive violation of the treaty. But the biggest gamble, the real roll of the dice, comes in 1936. He marches German troops back into the demilitarized Rhineland. Now this was a huge risk, but his timing? It was perfect. The world was totally distracted by Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, which had already destroyed whatever shred of credibility the League had left.
And the response was, well, you can probably guess. A lot of hand-wringing and protests, but zero action. In fact, Britain goes and signs a separate naval deal with Germany, basically giving them a thumbs up to break the Versailles Treaty. The aggressors see this, they see the weakness, and they team up, forming the Rome-Berlin axis. And with every successful gamble, the whole pace of this thing is about to speed up, a lot. This string of failures, this total inability to stand up to the dictators, it forces Britain and France into a new, pretty desperate strategy. A strategy with a name that would go down in history: appeasement.
At its heart, the idea was really simple. Just give the dictators some of what they want. The hope was that maybe, just maybe, they'd be satisfied and another world war could be avoided. It was a policy born from pure fear, and it was about to be put to the test almost immediately.
The first big test is in March 1938. Hitler just annexes Austria, the Anschluss. And the reaction from Britain and France? A deafening silence. They do absolutely nothing. This just tells Hitler he can get away with it. And so, of course, he immediately turns his attention to his next target, Czechoslovakia.
And his strategy for Czechoslovakia, it was cynical, but you have to admit, it was brilliant. He used the German-speaking population in a region called the Sudetenland as his excuse. And look at his instructions to his allies on the ground. Always demand so much that we can never be satisfied. He was engineering a crisis that he knew he could win.
And this all leads to the infamous Munich Conference. Britain and France, absolutely desperate to avoid war, fly to Munich to meet with Hitler and Mussolini. And there, they decide the fate of Czechoslovakia without a single Czech representative even allowed in the room. They force the Czechs to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, comes home waving a piece of paper promising peace in our time.
Yeah, so much for peace in our time. It lasted less than 6 months. In March of 1939, Hitler tore up his promise and sent his army to swallow the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement was officially dead. It hadn't bought peace. All it did was buy Hitler more time and make Germany even stronger.
With the disaster of appeasement clear to everyone, Britain and France finally draw a line in the sand. They guarantee the independence of Poland, which is obviously Hitler's next target. But Hitler, he's about to pull off a move so cynical, so shocking, it blindsided the entire world and paved his way to war.
This was the one thing nobody saw coming. The two biggest ideological enemies on the planet, Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact. Think about that. Publicly, it was just a promise not to fight each other. But the real deal, the truly ugly part, was kept secret. What the world didn't see was the devastating secret protocol. Hitler and Stalin had made a deal to literally carve up Poland between them. For Hitler, this was the jackpot. It was a green light. It meant he could invade Poland and not have to worry about fighting a two-front war against the Soviets in the East. The very last obstacle to his war was just gone.
With that deal signed, things moved at a terrifying speed. It took just 8 days. 8 days from the moment they shook hands in Moscow for the final domino to fall. And then it happened. At dawn on September 1st, German tanks and planes poured across the Polish border. The 20-year pause was over. The world was at war again. 2 days later, Neville Chamberlain, the man who had bet everything on appeasement, went on the radio to tell the British people that they were now at war with Germany. And his words are just this tragic admission of total failure, the final heartbreaking conclusion to this whole slide into disaster.
Which really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? When you look back at this whole chain of events, from Versailles to Manchuria, from the Rhineland to Munich, and finally to Poland, you have to ask yourself, was there ever a moment this could have been stopped? Or was the world's stumble into its most terrible war, in the end, simply inevitable?
Okay, I want to start today with a bit of a challenge. I want you to close your eyes and picture a map of Europe, specifically the borders.
Okay.
Now, if I told you to compare the map of Europe in 1929, so 10 years after World War I, with the map of Europe in 1989, right at the end of the Cold War, what would you expect to see?
Well, most people, I think, they'd assume they look completely different.
Right, of course.
I mean, we're talking about a 60-year gap filled with the most destructive war in human history, the rise and fall of empires, the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
You'd expect the lines to be totally redrawn.
Exactly. That is the intuitive answer. We all think of the Treaty of Versailles, that document that ended World War I, as this total disaster that, carved up Europe into unstable little puzzle pieces that were just doomed to fail. But digging into this stack of research we have today on the Great Crusade, there is this mind-bending fact right at the very beginning.
It really flips the narrative, doesn't it?
It does.
Because if you actually look at those two maps in 1929 and 1989, the boundaries are, well, shockingly similar.
Which implies that the borders drawn up at Versailles weren't actually the problem. They were durable. They kind of made sense.
Right. The geography wasn't the issue. The lines on the map worked. What failed, and this is what we're really docking into today, is the machinery meant to protect those lines. We're looking at how the world moved from the war to end all wars, to a catastrophe that was, exponentially worse, all in the span of just 2 decades.
It's the story of the hollow truce. And honestly, reading through this, it feels like watching a slow-motion train wreck where every single passenger thinks they're actually steering the train to the safety.
That is a very apt analogy. And I think the biggest mistake we make when we look at this period is we focus too much on the dates 1939, September 1st, the invasion of Poland.
The starting gun.
We treat that as the starting gun. But the research argues that the breakdown of order, the actual war on the international system, started much, much earlier.
And it didn't start in Europe.
No. It started in the East. We have this very Eurocentric view. But the source makes a compelling case that the fire was already raging in China and Japan, while European diplomats were still, patting themselves on the back.
So we have a lot of ground to cover. We need to look at the illusion of peace in Europe, the explosion of violence in Asia, and the rise of the dictators who took advantage of it all.
A huge canvas.
But let's start with that illusion. Let's talk about Germany, because the standard high school history lesson is Versailles was too harsh, Germany was crushed, so Hitler was inevitable.
It's the Carthaginian peace argument.
Right.
The idea that the Allies sowed the wind and, reaped the whirlwind. But the source material really challenges that. It argues that the Treaty of Versailles was actually quite moderate.
Moderate. I mean, they lost territory. They had to pay all those reparations. How is that moderate?
Well, context is everything. Compare Versailles to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That was the treaty Germany forced on Russia in 1918 when Germany was winning in the East. Germany stripped Russia of a massive amount of territory. Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, I mean, they were ruthless. Compared to what Germany did to others, Versailles was a slap on the wrist.
So the grievance wasn't about the specific terms.
The grievance was about the reality of defeat. You have to understand the German mindset in the 1920s. In 1918, their armies were still on French soil.
Right. They weren't occupied.
They didn't see themselves as a conquered people. They spent the entire interwar period in a state of denial. They felt they were still a great power that had been cheated, not a defeated nation that needed to rebuild trust.
That is a toxic starting point for peace. And you'd hope the guardians of peace, Britain and France, would be united in managing this sulking, angry giant.
You would hope.
But reading this, it feels like they were watching two completely different movies.
They were totally out of step, and this is fatal. France was traumatized. They had lost a generation of men. All they wanted was security. They wanted a cage for Germany, keep them weak so they could never invade again.
And Britain?
Britain was looking at their wallet. They cared about trade and the empire. They looked at Germany and saw a potential trading partner. They wanted to restore Germany as a great power to get the European economy moving again.
So while France is trying to lock the door, Britain is trying to open the window.
Exactly. And this disconnect leads to what seems like the high point of the 1920s, the Locarno Pact of 1925.
Right. On the surface, this looks great. Germany, France, Belgium, all shaking hands, guaranteeing borders, Nobel Peace Prizes all around.
It was the spirit of Locarno. It felt like the war was finally truly over. But there was a trapdoor built into the agreement that almost no one noticed at the time, or at least the public didn't.
Let's unpack that trapdoor, because Britain and Italy signed on as guarantors, right?
Yeah.
They were the bouncers. If anyone starts a fight, they jump in.
Theoretically, yes. But the guarantee was remarkably slippery. Britain effectively said, "We will only intervene if France and Germany fight." But the guarantee was only for the western borders of Germany.
Wait, only the West. So the border with France and Belgium is locked down.
Yeah.
But what about the East? What about Poland and Czechoslovakia?
Deliberately ignored. And think about the message that sends. By explicitly guaranteeing the West and staying silent on the East, the great powers were basically signaling to Germany.
The front door is locked, but the back door.
The back door. We don't really care about the back door. It's a green light disguised as a peace treaty.
They basically told Germany, if you want to expand, go east.
Precisely. It left the eastern borders legally second class. And as we know, that is exactly where the war eventually ignited.
So while Europe is congratulating itself on this half-baked treaty, things are getting very, very dark on the other side of the world. The source argues the challenge to peace really begins in the Far East. And this brings us to a concept that I found absolutely terrifying. Gekkokujo.
Gekkokujo. It's a Japanese term. It translates roughly to insubordination, or, maybe more descriptively, the manipulation of senior officers by their juniors.
When I first read that, I thought it meant, arguing with your boss. But we aren't talking about workplace disagreements here.
No. This is the inmates running the asylum, but with heavy artillery. You have to look at the Japanese Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria. These were young, radical officers who believed in a divine mission for Japan to lead Asia and kick out Western influence.
And they just didn't care what the civilian government in Tokyo said.
Not at all. There is this crazy story in the research about the assassination of Chang Solin. He was a Chinese warlord in Manchuria.
Right, this is 1928.
It's 1928. The Japanese government in Tokyo is trying to be cautious. They don't want a war. But the Kwantung Army officers decide, no, we want chaos so we can take over. So without telling anyone in Tokyo, they plant a bomb on a railway bridge and blow up Chang Solin's train.
That is a massive act of war. And the government in Tokyo did what?
Nothing. And that's the Gekkokujo problem. The government was too afraid of the military to punish them, so the army realized, we can do whatever we want.
And 3 years later, in 1931, they do it again, the invasion of Manchuria.
The Mukden incident. Same playbook. The army stages an explosion, blames the Chinese, and invades. The government in Tokyo wakes up to find out they are at war, and instead of stopping it, they just folded.
Wow.
The parliamentary government effectively collapsed, and the Rikugun took control of the state.
But this wasn't just about power-hungry soldiers, was it? The source mentions the Great Depression played a huge role here.
Oh, huge. The Depression hit Japan incredibly hard. Their exports collapsed. They were desperate for resources and markets. Manchuria was rich in soy, coal, iron, so you have this toxic mix of economic desperation and this fanatical ideology that said, we have a right to take this.
Okay, so you have a rogue army seizing a territory the size of France. This is the moment for the League of Nations. This is what it was built for.
To say, stop, put it back.
Yes. This was the first major test of the collective security system.
And to put it bluntly, the League failed miserably.
How does an organization representing the entire world just fail?
It was a failure of will. Britain and France looked at Manchuria and said, it's far away, we have our own economic problems, we don't want to send ships. And the U.S., we weren't even in the League. We issued moral condemnations. We said, we don't recognize this conquest.
Which is basically sending a sternly worded letter while someone is robbing a bank.
Exactly. Japan looked at the Western reaction, realized no one was going to stop them, and just quit the League. They kept Manchuria.
And the lesson for the rest of the world, for Mussolini, for Hitler, is crystal clear.
The police are asleep.
You can take what you want.
Collective security is a myth. And that emboldened Japan to go even further, which leads us to the full-scale tragedy of 1937.
The invasion of China proper. This started with the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Again, it sounds like such a minor skirmish.
It started that way, a confusing firefight near Beijing. In a normal world, diplomats would have smoothed it over. But because of that Gakukujo spirit, the Japanese field commanders refused to de-escalate. They wanted the war. They pushed and pushed until it became a full-scale, undeclared conflict.
And the source gets very dark here. We have to talk about Nanking.
Yes, the rape of Nanking. It is. It's difficult to read. After the Japanese army captured the capital, Nanking, in December 1937, they unleashed a campaign of terror that is just hard to comprehend.
What are the numbers?
The source notes that in just 7 weeks, an estimated 200,000 Chinese were butchered.
200,000 in 7 weeks.
It was mass murder, systematic rape, looting. It shocked the world. I mean, even the Nazis in Nanking were sending reports back to Berlin saying, this is inhuman. But again, no one intervened.
And yet, despite this overwhelming brutality, despite capturing Beijing, Shanghai, Nanking, Japan couldn't actually win.
That's the strategic paradox. Japan was winning all the battles, but they were losing the war. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader, he realized he couldn't beat the Japanese army head-on, so he traded space for time.
Lured them in.
Exactly. He retreated deep into the interior, to the mountains, to Chongqing. Japan was bogged down. They controlled the cities and the train lines, but the countryside was hostile. They were stuck in a quagmire, spending blood and treasure with no end in sight.
So while Asia is burning, let's pivot back to Europe. Because there is a man in Berlin watching all of this very, very closely. Adolf Hitler. So source makes a really interesting distinction about Hitler's rise.
Yeah.
We often hear he was just a byproduct of the Depression, that if the economy was good, there'd be no Hitler. But the research says it's deeper than that.
It is. Hitler wasn't just fixing the unemployment rate. He was tapping into something much older in German culture. This romantic value of will over reason. The idea that a strong will can overcome reality. He viewed the world not through economics, but through racial struggle, a Darwinian fight for survival.
And he played the Western democracies like a fiddle. The twin-track policy. It sounds like something from a spy novel.
It was incredibly effective gaslighting. On one track, Hitler would give these passionate speeches about peace. He'd say, I have seen war. I never want war again. He offered non-aggression pacts. He promised disarmament.
And on the other track,
rearmament at breakneck speed. Tanks, planes, conscription. Every time the West caught him building weapons, he would say, oh, I only want peace. I'm just looking for equality with my neighbors. And the West wanted to believe him. They were so desperate to avoid war, they just swallowed the lie.
And then came the gamble, the Rhineland, 1936. The source calls this the turning point where the balance of power actually shifted.
This is the definitive what-if moment. The Rhineland was German territory, but under the treaties, it was demilitarized. No troops allowed. Hitler decided to march his army back in.
But his army was still weak at this point, right?
Tiny. The source says his generals were terrified. They had orders to retreat immediately if the French showed up. If France had just marched a few divisions to the border, Hitler would have been humiliated. He likely would have been overthrown by his own generals.
So why didn't France move?
Paralysis. France was in the middle of a political crisis. They wouldn't move without Britain. And Britain took the view of, well, he's only walking into his own backyard.
They didn't see the strategic implication.
Not at all. The implication was, by remilitarizing the Rhineland, Hitler could now build fortifications on the French border. That meant he could block France out. Once he walled off the west, he had a free hand to attack the east.
So France's allies in East Poland, Czechoslovakia, they were suddenly on their own.
They realized France couldn't help them even if she wanted to. France lost her credibility without firing a shot, and Hitler realized these people will not fight.
So he ramps up the aggression. In 1938, you get the Anschluss. He absorbs Austria.
Yes, and the way he did it was classic bullying. He drags the Austrian Chancellor, Schuschnigg, to a meeting, screams at him, forces him to cancel a vote on independence, and then just marches in.
And again, Britain and France treat it as a domestic affair.
It's just Germans uniting with Germans.
Which brings us to the absolute nadir of this story, Section 5 in our outline, but really the emotional center of the failure, Munich, the Sudetenland crisis.
This is where appeasement becomes a dirty word. Hitler demands the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia where many Germans lived. But this wasn't just about people. The Sudetenland was where all of Czechoslovakia's mountain defenses were.
So without those mountains, the country was defenseless.
Completely. And we should clarify, Czechoslovakia wasn't some unstable mess. It was the only real democracy east of the Rhine. It had a modern army. It was a loyal ally to France.
And they were ready to fight.
They were. But Britain and France decided that Czechoslovakia wasn't worth a world war.
The source is pretty harsh on Neville Chamberlain here. It wasn't just that he was scared of war. It's that he fundamentally didn't care about the Czechs.
Right. It was a cold, brutal calculation. Chamberlain didn't trust the Soviet Union, who actually offered to help defend Czechoslovakia. He despised communism more than he feared fascism at that point, so he decided to cut a deal with the dictator.
So they meet in Munich, September 1938. Mussolini, Hitler, Daladier from France, Chamberlain from Britain. Who was missing from that room?
The Czechs. They were waiting in the hallway, literally while the great powers carved up their country, and the Soviets weren't invited either.
Imagine that. Your country is being dismantled, your borders are being redrawn, and you aren't even allowed a seat at the table.
It's shameful. Chamberlain flies back to London waving that famous piece of paper, declaring peace in our time. He thought he had satisfied Hitler. He thought he was a hero.
But the illusion didn't last long.
Less than 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. He invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, the parts with no Germans. He occupied Prague.
And that must have been the moment the scales fell from everyone's eyes.
It was. You couldn't claim it was about self-determination anymore. Hitler was conquering non-German people. The British public finally turned. They realized war was inevitable. Chamberlain's policy was in ruins.
But Hitler had one more shock in store. The unholy alliance. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939.
I mean, if you were living in 1939, this would have made your head explode. Hitler and Stalin were mortal enemies. Fascism and communism were defined by their hatred of each other. And suddenly, they announce a non-aggression pact.
It's like Batman teaming up with the Joker. It doesn't make any sense. Why did they do it?
Pure cynicism. For Hitler, it meant he wouldn't have to fight a two-front war. He could attack Poland without the Soviets coming in from the east. For Stalin, it bought him time to rebuild his army and, well, it gave him territory.
Secret protocols.
Right. They didn't just agree not to fight. They secretly agreed to divide Poland and the Baltic states between them. They carved up Eastern Europe like a turkey.
So Poland was doomed before the first tank even rolled.
Completely. Britain had given Poland a blank check guarantee saying, we will protect you. But physically, geographically, Britain couldn't help Poland. The only power that could have saved Poland was the Soviet Union. And Britain had just let the Soviets side with Hitler.
So, September 1st, 1939, the inevitable happens. Germany invades Poland. The Great Crusade begins.
And the Hollow Truce ends.
There's a really powerful comparison in the outro of the source material. It contrasts the speeches given on September 3rd, the day Britain officially declared war. You have King George VI, and you have Neville Chamberlain.
The contrast is devastating. King George VI stepped up. He spoke of civilization, justice, and humanity. He framed the war as a cosmic struggle between good and evil. He understood the stakes.
And Chamberlain?
Chamberlain's speech was tragic and small. He spoke about his own bitter blow. He talked about his personal disappointment that his policy had failed. The source says he sounded like he was speaking to domestic servants, telling them, "You have your jobs to do."
He was worried about his resume while the world was catching fire.
Exactly. He failed to grasp the unprecedented power and virulence of the war that had just begun. He was a man of the 19th century trying to manage a 20th century catastrophe.
It really drives home the synthesis of this entire deep dive. World War II didn't happen because of a single spark in Poland. It happened because the machinery of peace was systematically dismantled piece by piece.
Yes. The League of Nations, the treaties, the concept of collective security, they were all stripped away. Japan kicked the door open in Manchuria, and the European powers were too divided and self-interested to close it. By the time 1939 rolled around, the Old World, where Europe called the shots, was already dead.
The war just confirmed the autopsy.
Precisely. With the U.S. and USSR rising and the European powers exhausting themselves, the era of European supremacy was over before the first shot was even fired.
That is a heavy realization. So here's the thought I want to leave you with today. We saw Britain and France, the guardians, repeatedly choose their own immediate self-interest. They ignored Manchuria because it was far away. They ignored Ethiopia. They sold out Czechoslovakia to buy themselves a few more months of peace.
They chose the easy path every single time.
Right. So the question is, if the big powers always choose self-interest over the security of the whole, is global conflict inevitable? Or was there a moment, maybe in the Rhineland, maybe in Manchuria, where one brave decision, one moment of actually standing up for the principles they wrote down on paper, could have stopped the avalanche?
That is the question that haunts this entire century. What if?
A huge thank you to our expert for connecting those dots today, and thank you for listening. This has been The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.